The Peach Bowl is the second playoff game we're going to be watching on New Year's Eve. And Ohio State and Georgia in Atlanta set to get after it. Georgia's favored by 6.5 in this game, so just shy of a touchdown. And for Georgia, you would think that a lot of the conversation would be around, okay, well, let's repeat, let's get back to back. I think this program is thinking about creating their own legacy because there's a lot of guys on this team, especially on the defensive side, that weren't starters last year, that are trying to one-up what happened last year. Remember, last year's team didn't win the SEC title. This year's team did, and they're very, very proud of that. They're trying to cement their own legacy. And there is no letdown. There's no drinking their own Kool-Aid. There's no feeling good about winning the SEC. It is reload, and the main thing's the main thing. And for a Kirby Smart coach program, would you expect anything less? Don't think so. For Ohio State, remember how their regular season ended? It wasn't winning the Big Ten championship, and it wasn't beating Michigan, both of which are not the standard in Columbus. There was a lot of people after that game in Columbus where they lost to Michigan that was, unhappy feels like a soft term to use. We had people in our videos, in our comment section saying, fire Ryan Day. Guys lost single-digit games as the head coach at Ohio State, but all right. So for this game, they have new life. Because remember, they had some things happen where USC lost, some other teams lost, where Ohio State just sort of backdoored their way into the college football playoff. If you're Georgia and Kirby Smart, you got to be saying, are you kidding me? We got to play Ohio State, who for most of the year was sitting there in that number 2 spot when these rankings came out. I'm just saying, for Ohio State to be in the playoff and have as many weapons as they do, and to have that second breath, to have new life coming into the playoff, that makes them dangerous. I'm just telling you. They thought their season was over. I thought they were going to be headed to Pasadena, which for a lot of people in the Buckeye community, yeah, your season's over if you're playing for the Rose Bowl. A lot of guys opt out. Not so fast, my friend. CJ Stroud says, run that back. Marvin Harrison Jr. tweeting, let's go. Ohio State is very dangerous because of what happened in that Michigan game. They faced their own mortality. They're ready for this one. Should be a whole lot of fun. Hinge points in this one. First thing I'm looking at, does Georgia set the pace of this game? Do they get to set the tempo? Do they start fast? Because if they do, I think you could see a game that's similar in style to the LSU-Georgia game in the SEC title. Because remember what we talked about in that game? After it ended at least, wow, LSU threw for 500 yards. LSU's offense, were they perfect? No, but they had a ton of production. The output was really solid. I don't care who it was against. LSU had a really good showing offensively. The reality is it didn't matter. It just didn't matter what LSU did offensively because Georgia got out quick, returned that blocked field goal for a touchdown, and that was kind of the end of it. Like, you're not catching Georgia if you spot them 14 points, 10 points. For as good as they are offensively, Stetson Bennett and his experience, and Brock Bowers, and they get A.D. Mitchell back now, like, this is a Ferrari. You don't catch that Ferrari in a drag race, especially when you give them a few yards of a head start. So if they can't set the tempo, if they do start slow, that's when we've seen them look human. Because Georgia hasn't just been 40-point victories all the way up to this game. They've had some games where they've sort of sputtered. They've had to win ugly, which I think will help them in this game, actually. But when we've seen them look human, it's been those slow starts. Think of Missouri. Think of Kentucky. That could be the kryptonite for them. And if they're able to, Ohio State that is, force Georgia into a slow start, well, then you give your offense a little bit more of a chance. Then for Georgia, you start to risk the explosiveness of what Marvin Harrison Jr. can do on the outside. More on that in a second. But the reality for Georgia, if you start fast, you could make this thing a little bit more boring for those of us watching at home, if you catch my drift. If you haven't yet subscribed, we'd love to have you at the party. I cannot say it enough. The playoffs about to get on and popping. Bowl season turning up the heat. The national championship game. Got an exciting announcement coming for you here in the near future. Keep you posted on that. Make sure you're subscribed. Like, bottom line, we don't want you to miss anything. We want you involved in this community as much as possible. So roll party roll. Make sure you're subbed. Also, follow me on Twitter and on Instagram at JD Paquel. A lot of interaction we do there that we can then incorporate into our live program. All right. How much does Ohio State get in the passing game? LSU got 500. You're telling me LSU, who No knock on them. Haven't been extremely impressive all year long throwing the football. Their MO was really running the ball, remember? You're telling me Ohio State can't do better than that? You're telling me if LSU put forth that kind of effort, Ohio State doesn't at least have the potential to have a day throwing the football? Now, here's the other thing I would say. I promise you, Kirby Smart and company, since that game ended in Atlanta, that was all they were talking about. How LSU threw for 500 and they didn't execute. They didn't finish the game well. They still took care of business and got themselves an SEC title. But I'm just saying that's out there. That's on tape. That's what you've been watching if you're C.J. Stroud. That's what you've been watching if you're Brian Hartline and Marvin Harrison Jr., Julian Fleming. We go down the list here. They have some weapons to make this thing really, really interesting. In a game like this, we've said it multiple times, whenever you have, I say underdog very loosely because it's 6.5 points, but you're an underdog nonetheless. Ohio State doesn't have all the matchups in this game. They don't have probably the line of scrimmage advantage on either side. You could argue they don't have the run game advantage. The one advantage they could have is on the outside. And when you're the underdog, you don't need all the matchups. You just need one that you can continue to go back to and go back to the well time and time again throughout this game. I think for them, for Ohio State that is, that matchup lies on the outside. Lay on the outside. You feel what I'm saying here. If you can win this game, it'll be because of guys like Marvin Harrison Jr. Because I don't think you're going to beat Georgia at their own game. I don't think you're going to just win the trenches if you're Georgia, or if you're Ohio State, rather. For Georgia, if they're able to play a game similar to the Tennessee game, where you win one-on-one on the outside, whether it's Keely Ringo or whoever it is out there, if you can win on an island, well, then you ask Ohio State to be that trenches team consistently. And that's advantage Georgia every single time. When you got to play in the box as an offense against Georgia, it favors Kirby Smart and his team. That's their MO. That's who they are. They're going to be physical with you in between the tackles. But if you can win outside, kind of a moot point. If you hear what I'm saying here. All right. So what is the story in the box? I think that's the last thing you got to look at. For Georgia, I keep going back to that Tennessee game because I think that's kind of the way Ohio State's built. They're not quite as schematically complicated in my mind in terms of those super wide splits and making you cover all 53.3 of the width of the field. But that's still who Ohio State wants to be. They still want to get it out to their playmakers and let their best players impact the game. If you take that away, just what I said a second ago, you ask Ohio State to play back in the box. And the comp for me for Ohio State is, when it comes to the defensive side of things, I keep thinking about that Michigan game. Sold out to stop the run, and then what happened? We're solid in the first half, kept them to something like 30-ish yards in the first half, give or take a few yards. But in the second half, the dam broke. In the second half, those big human beings from Michigan just asserted their will and pushed that defensive line out of the way for Ohio State. So for Ohio State, you got to have some stamina in the trenches when Georgia has the football. They're so multiple to where if you can at least force them off schedule, if you can at least force them to have to throw the football, I'm not saying you make Stetson Bennett beat you. Many have tried, many have failed, but you have to have something to hold up in the trenches. Because if you can't, again, it's going to be a boring game for all of us watching at home. So at the end of the day, I think Ohio State has the firepower to make this game really interesting. Marvin Harrison Jr., I still believe, has a very real debate to be the best wide receiver in the country. A lot of people agree with me. He could be the chess piece that takes over this whole game. With that being said, I think the experience of Georgia at places that matter, and Kirby Smart, their head coach, Stetson Bennett, their 37-year-old quarterback, a guy who's played in a lot of big games in his time at Georgia, and the physicality they have on both sides of the line of scrimmage. Tough teams win these kind of games. I'm not saying Ohio State's not tough. I think Ohio State is tougher than they were a season ago, but you drew the toughest team in college football 2 weeks in a row now, 2 games in a row in Michigan and Georgia. So I think Georgia ends up winning this game. They push Ohio State around and pull away late to win this football game 34-24, and the Dogs are headed back to the national championship game. Hey y'all, thanks so much for watching. Subscribe to the channel here to make sure you don't miss an episode of The Hard Count. Also be sure to check out other videos on the On3 YouTube channel.